I opened my eyes in a hospital bed after 9 days, and the first thing my husband said to me wasn't "I love you." It was, "Don't be mad, we had to make decisions while you were out." For a moment I couldn't understand why Marcus was standing so far from the bed instead of close to it. He had one hand on the doorframe like he needed something to hold on to. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were red, but not from crying, from avoiding sleep, or avoiding me, or both. "What decisions?" I asked. My voice came out cracked and unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone who had been screaming underwater. He didn't answer right away. He walked to the chair beside the bed, picked up a folder and set it on my lap without opening it. "Just look," he said quietly, "before you get upset. Just look first." I opened the folder with hands that still shook from 9 days of stillness. Inside was a property deed. Our address was printed at the top, the small brick house on Larkspur Lane that I had inherited from my father 3 years earlier. The house I had spent 18 months slowly repainting and repairing on weekends because I couldn't afford to hire anyone and didn't want to wait. My name was gone from the ownership line. His sister's name was there instead. I read it twice, certain I was misreading it, certain the accident had done something to my vision along with everything else. But the letters didn't change. Paige Carell, sole owner. Signed and notarized 6 days earlier, while I was lying in an induced coma with a ventilator doing the work my lungs couldn't manage on their own. My name was gone, I said out loud, mostly to myself. Paige's name is on it instead. Marcus reached for my hand. I pulled it back before he could take it. "My name is Diana Whitfield. I am 34 years old, and until that morning in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and stale coffee, I believed my family, difficult as they sometimes were, would never do something like this to me while I couldn't even lift my own head off a pillow. I was wrong about almost everything that week. But I want to take you back before the accident, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly what that house meant, and exactly how long I had spent being the person everyone in that family quietly relied on and just as quietly overlooked. My father built the house on Larkspur Lane himself, one summer at a time, over almost a decade. He wasn't a builder by trade. He worked at a hardware distribution warehouse for 31 years and taught himself plumbing and framing from library books and stubbornness. My mother passed when I was 19, and after that it was just the two of us in that house until he died of a stroke 3 years ago, sitting in the same recliner he'd owned since I was in middle school. I have memories of that house going back further than I have memories of almost anything else. Learning to ride a bike in the driveway while my father jogged alongside, holding the seat until his back gave out and he had to let go without telling me. Sitting on the back porch steps the night my mother died, not understanding yet what the word meant, only understanding that my father hadn't said a single word in 3 hours. Every room in that house carries something of him in it, from the uneven floorboard in the hallway he never got around to fixing, to the exact shade of blue he chose for the bedroom ceiling because my mother once said she liked looking up at something calm. He left me the house outright. No mortgage, because he'd paid it off the year before he died. Proud of that, the way some men are proud of a car or a boat. I moved in within a month, partly because I couldn't bear to sell it, and partly because Marcus and I had been saving for a place of our own, and this solved the problem for us both. I want to be honest, Marcus's family never fully accepted that the house was mine. From the very first dinner we hosted there, his mother walked through every room commenting on what she'd change if it were theirs. His father, Walter, a retired real estate attorney who had spent 40 years drafting contracts for other people's property disputes, made a habit of referring to it as the family house within a year of my moving in, as though ownership were a matter of proximity rather than paperwork. I let it go. I always let it go. That was, I think, the central failure of those years, though I didn't see it as a failure at the time. I saw it as keeping the peace. When Marcus lost his job for 8 months during a downturn in his industry, I covered every bill without complaint, including 2 months of his student loan payments that I never mentioned again. When his mother needed hip surgery and the family couldn't agree on how to split the cost, I quietly paid for the private room upgrade myself and let everyone believe insurance had covered it. When Paige, his younger sister, went through her divorce 4 years ago, I let her stay in our guest room for 5 months, cooked dinner for her every night, and never once brought up when she might find her own place. Paige and I were never close, not really. She had a way of treating kindness as though it were owed to her rather than given. But I told myself that was simply her personality, and that families absorbed each other's rough edges because that's what families did. I remember one Thanksgiving, maybe 2 years into the marriage, when Walter stood up during dessert and announced that the family should think about formalizing who would eventually take over the Larkspur Lane property, since it was, in his words, too valuable an asset to leave uncertain. I laughed at first, thinking it was one of his dry jokes. Nobody else laughed. Marcus changed the subject by asking his mother about the pie. I let it go, the way I let everything go, and told myself I had imagined the seriousness in his voice. Looking back, I don't think I imagined anything. I think I simply didn't want to see it. The accident happened on a Tuesday evening in March. I remember because I had left work early to pick up paint samples for the kitchen, something small and hopeful, a project just for me. A driver ran a red light 2 blocks from the hardware store. I don't remember the impact. I remember the paint samples scattered across the passenger seat in the last photograph anyone showed me afterward, small rectangles of sage green and warm white, undisturbed while everything else in the car was destroyed. I was in the ICU for 4 days before they placed me in the induced coma to manage the swelling in my brain. 9 days total, according to the discharge paperwork I read weeks later, though I have no memory of most of it. What I do have now is a very clear record of what happened during those 9 days on the outside, because I made it my business to find out every detail once I understood what my family had done. According to the notary logs I later requested, on day 6 of my coma, while I was on a ventilator in a bed 2 floors above the hospital's administrative office, Walter Whitfield walked into that same building with a document already drafted and a notary already scheduled. He had been my father's attorney friend once, decades earlier, and he still knew people. He still knew how paperwork moved. The house on Larkspur Lane had never technically left my name alone. When my father set up his estate before he died, his own attorney, a man named Thomas Aldridge who had known our family for 30 years, recommended placing the house into a small revocable trust rather than a straightforward inheritance, mainly for tax reasons. I was the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary. There was, however, one detail I had genuinely forgotten in the 3 years since, because it had never once seemed relevant. My father, wanting to make sure I had support managing something that large if anything ever happened to me, had named a secondary co-trustee who could act only in the event I was declared legally incapacitated. That secondary co-trustee was Walter. He had never used that authority. Not once, in 3 years. I doubt I thought about that clause more than twice in all that time. While I was in the coma, with a court-appointed physician's letter confirming temporary incapacitation, Walter's authority as co-trustee activated exactly as the document intended. What it was never intended to authorize, and what the trust language explicitly required, was unanimous action for any transfer of the property itself. A single trustee, even an activated one, could manage bills, maintain insurance, and handle small administrative matters. A transfer of ownership required both trustees, meaning both signatures, mine included, incapacitated or not. Walter forged my signature. I didn't know that yet, lying in that hospital bed with the folder on my lap. All I knew was that a house my father built with his own hands now belonged, on paper, to his sister. Paige needed a fresh start after everything with the divorce, Marcus said, still standing at a careful distance. Dad thought, Since you were unconscious and nobody knew how long recovery would take, it made more sense for someone to actually be living there and maintaining it, instead of it sitting empty. It wasn't sitting empty, I said. I live there. I was going to keep living there. We didn't know that for certain, he said, and something in the way he said it told me he had rehearsed this conversation more than once, probably with his father, probably in the hospital cafeteria while I couldn't ask a single question. The doctors weren't sure in the beginning how much you'd recover. Dad said it was better to be practical. I looked at my husband, a man I had been married to for 6 years, and understood for the first time that he had watched his father and sister make a decision about my father's house, while I could not speak, could not object, could not even squeeze a hand to say no, and his response had been to help carry the folder into my hospital room rather than to stop it from happening in the first place. "Where is Paige living now?" I asked. "She moved in about 4 days ago," he said. "She's been getting the place ready. New paint, actually. She said the kitchen needed it." I thought about the paint samples, sage green and warm white, still sitting somewhere in an evidence bag from a car that no longer existed. I didn't argue that day. I want to be honest about that too. I was exhausted in a way I had never experienced, a bone-deep exhaustion that made even holding a conversation feel like lifting something heavy. I let Marcus think my silence meant acceptance. It didn't. It meant I needed time to understand exactly what I was looking at before I said another word about it. My closest friend from work, a woman named Priya, who had known me since my first year at the marketing firm, drove 2 hours each way every Sunday to sit with me at the rehabilitation facility. She was the only person outside the family who knew, in those early weeks, exactly what had happened with the house. I told her everything on her second visit, half expecting her to say I was overreacting, that grief and confusion after a coma could make anything feel like a betrayal. She didn't say that. She sat very still for a moment, then asked me a single question. "Did anyone ask you, even once, before they decided what to do with your father's house?" Nobody had. Saying it out loud, to someone with no stake in the family's comfort, made the shape of it clearer than it had been in my own head. I wasn't confused about what had happened. I was still recovering from being told, without being asked, that my consent didn't matter as long as the outcome was convenient for everyone else. "Then stop trying to be reasonable about it before you even know the facts," Priya told me. "Find out what actually happened first. You can decide how to feel about it after." That was the push I needed. Over the following 2 weeks, while I moved from the hospital to a rehabilitation facility to relearn basic strength in my legs, I asked a nurse to help me use a laptop for 20 minutes a day. I looked up the trust documents my father's attorney had filed. I looked up notary requirements for real estate transfers in our state. I read about co-trustee authority until the language stopped feeling like a foreign dialect and started feeling like a map. Then I called Thomas Aldridge. He remembered me immediately, remembered my father even more fondly, and when I explained what had happened, there was a long silence on the line before he spoke again. "Diana," he said, "I need you to send me a copy of that new deed the moment you can get one. Don't discuss this with your husband's family until I've reviewed it. Not one word." While Thomas worked on the notary comparison, I requested my own complete hospital record from the medical records department, something I was legally entitled to as the patient. It took 2 phone calls and a signed release form, but within a week I had a printed timeline of every vital sign, every medication dose, every ventilator adjustment recorded during those 9 days. I read through it slowly, matching timestamps against dates, building a version of those 9 days that existed outside anyone's memory or convenience. By the time Thomas called with his findings, I already had my own quiet certainty sitting on the kitchen table in front of me. It took him 4 days to call back. When he did, his voice had a different weight to it, the careful weight of a man who has found something he wishes he hadn't. "The signature on that document is not yours," he said. I compared it against 3 notarized signatures of yours already on file with our office from your father's estate paperwork. The letter formation is close, someone clearly tried, but the pressure pattern and the spacing are wrong in ways that are very hard to fake convincingly. More importantly, the notary log for that day shows the signing took place at 10:40 in the morning at an office downtown. Your hospital admission records show you were in an induced coma, on a ventilator, in the intensive care unit, at that exact time. There is no possible way you signed anything that day, Diana, anywhere. I sat with that for a long moment before I asked the only question that mattered. Can this be undone? Yes, he said, without hesitation, and it needs to be quickly because forging a signature on a property transfer isn't just invalid. Depending on how your family chooses to respond when confronted, it can also be a criminal matter. I don't want anyone arrested, I said, surprising myself with how quickly the words came. I want my father's house back, that's all. Then let's start there, he said, but I want you prepared. People who do something like this rarely believe they'll be caught. When they are, they don't always react well. I asked him to prepare everything quietly first, before I said a word to Marcus. I didn't want another folder handed to me across a hospital tray table with a rehearsed explanation waiting behind it. I wanted the truth sitting in a drawer, ready, before anyone had the chance to talk me out of using it. It took 3 weeks for the paperwork to be ready. In that time, I moved back into Marcus's apartment because I had nowhere else to go, and I watched him field phone calls from Paige about paint colors and a new dishwasher she wanted installed, all while I sat on the couch with a cane beside me, saying nothing, learning to walk properly again, one hallway length at a time. Twice during those 3 weeks, Marcus mentioned, almost casually, that maybe once I was fully recovered, we could talk about the house situation, as though it were an open negotiation rather than a forged deed. Both times I said I wasn't ready to discuss it yet. Both times he seemed relieved rather than concerned, and that relief told me more about where he stood than any conversation could have. The day everything came apart was a Sunday, chosen deliberately because the whole family gathered every other Sunday at Walter and his wife's house for dinner, a tradition that had outlasted every other family habit I could think of. I asked Thomas Aldridge to be there, not inside the house, but parked outside, ready. I walked in on my own, cane in hand, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when someone wasn't expected. "You're looking so much stronger," Walter said, standing to greet me with the easy warmth of a man who has never once doubted his own decisions. "I am," I said, "strong enough to talk about the house." Paige, seated at the far end of the table, set down her fork carefully. "We can talk about it whenever you're ready," she said. "There's no rush. I've just been keeping it maintained." "You've been living in it," I said, "in a house that isn't yours." Walter's expression shifted, the practiced patience of a man used to controlling every room he entered. "Diana, I understand this feels sudden to you, waking up to changes, but I want you to understand the position we were in. We didn't know if you'd recover fully. We didn't know how long rehabilitation would take. Someone needed to make a decision, and as the trustee with activated authority during your incapacitation, that decision was legally mine to make." "It wasn't," I said. "The transfer required both trustees' signatures, mine and yours. You forged mine." The table went silent in a different way this time, a way that had weight to it. "That's a serious accusation," Walter said, his voice lower now. "It's not an accusation," I said. "It's a finding. I had the signature compared by a document examiner against 3 notarized samples on file. It doesn't match, and the notary log places the signing at 10:40 in the morning on a day I was on a ventilator in an intensive care unit. There is a paper trail for exactly where I was and exactly what my body was capable of doing at that hour, and it was not signing my name to a deed." Marcus, who had been quiet since I walked in, finally spoke. "Dad, tell her that's not what happened." Walter didn't answer right away, And in that silence, I watched something in my husband's face fall apart, the same way mine must have fallen apart in the hospital when I first opened that folder. "I did what needed to be done," Walter finally said, his voice tight. "I have practiced law for 40 years. I know how to handle a document." "You knew exactly what you were doing," I said, "which is why you didn't wait to ask me. You knew I'd say no." Paige's chair scraped back. "This is insane. I moved my whole life into that house. I gave up my apartment." "You gave up an apartment to move into a house that was never offered to you," I said. "It was taken." Thomas Aldridge walked in then, at the moment we'd agreed on, carrying a folder considerably thicker than the one Marcus had once handed me. He introduced himself calmly, explained that he represented me in the matter of the property on Larkspur Lane, and laid out, point by point, what the forensic document examination had found, what the notary logs confirmed, and what the legal consequences could be if the family chose not to cooperate with reversing the transfer voluntarily. "I am giving your family the opportunity to correct this quietly," he said, looking directly at Walter. "A voluntary reconveyance, executed properly this time, with Diana's actual signature. If that doesn't happen within 7 days, we proceed with a formal complaint, which, given the nature of the forgery, would also be forwarded to the State Bar Association given your license, and potentially to the district attorney's office." Walter's face had gone the color of old paper. "You wouldn't," he said. "I would rather not," I said. "I would rather you simply sign the papers and give me my father's house back." Paige started crying, the loud, indignant crying of someone who believes they are the wronged party. "I don't even have anywhere else to go now." "You had somewhere to go before this," I said. "Your old apartment, your job, a life that wasn't built on top of mine." Nobody at that table defended Walter or Paige. Not really. His wife, Marcus's mother, stared at her plate for a long time before finally saying, quietly, that she had told Walter this would come back on him, though she admitted she hadn't said it loudly enough at the time for anyone to actually stop him. A cousin who had been invited that Sunday quietly excused herself to the kitchen rather than sit through the rest of it. Even Marcus, who had helped carry that first folder into my hospital room, sat with his hands over his face, saying nothing, offering nothing, and in the end his silence told me everything I still needed to know about where he had stood on the day it mattered most. The 6 days that followed were the longest of that entire year, longer even than the 9 days I couldn't remember. Marcus's mother called twice, once to ask if there was any way to settle this within the family without lawyers, and once to simply cry on the phone for 11 minutes without asking anything of me at all. Paige texted once, a single line asking if I would at least let her stay until she found a new apartment, and I told her the deadline Thomas had set applied to everyone, no exceptions, no extensions. Walter never called at all. I found out later, through Marcus, that he had spent most of those 6 days at his own attorney's office trying to find an argument that would hold up, and finding none. It took 6 days, not 7, for the reconveyance paperwork to be signed and filed. Properly this time, witnessed and notarized with 3 separate people confirming identity. Walter did not go to prison. I never filed the criminal complaint, not because I forgave him, but because pursuing it would have taken years I didn't want to spend fighting instead of healing. Thomas Aldridge told me that was entirely my choice to make, and I made it. Some costs simply weren't worth what they would have taken from me. Paige moved out within the week. She sent one text message afterward, 3 lines long, half apology and half justification. The kind of message that manages to say sorry without actually taking responsibility for anything. I read it once and didn't respond. Marcus and I are still working through what his silence in that hospital room meant, and what it will keep meaning going forward. I haven't decided yet whether our marriage survives this. I know that trust, once you've watched it get forged as literally as a signature on a deed, doesn't rebuild itself just because the paperwork is corrected. I told him that directly, and for the first time in 6 years, he didn't have a rehearsed response ready. I moved back into the house on Larkspur Lane alone at first, 3 weeks after the reconveyance was finalized. I repainted the kitchen myself, slowly, with the same sage green and warm white I had picked out the day of the accident, because some things deserved to be finished exactly the way they were originally intended. The day the corrected deed arrived in the mail, my name printed cleanly on the ownership line where it had always belonged, I sat at the kitchen table and read it 3 times, the same way I had once read the wrong version 3 times in a hospital bed. There was no dramatic music, no crowd of relatives watching, just me, a cup of coffee going cold, and a single sheet of paper that had taken a coma, a forged signature, and 6 of the hardest days of my life to make right. Marcus and I have been living apart since then, though we haven't formally decided anything permanent. He calls sometimes, asks how physical therapy is going, asks if I need help with anything around the house, and I let him help with small things because refusing every gesture felt like its own kind of exhausting. But I've noticed he no longer defends his father when the subject comes up, and that alone tells me something shifted in him that Sunday, even if it came far too late to undo what his silence had already cost. Priya comes over most Sundays now, the way she once drove 2 hours to sit with me in rehab. Last month we sat on the back porch my father built with his own hands, drinking coffee, watching the paint I'd finally finished dry evenly along the trim, and she asked if I regretted not pressing criminal charges against Walter. I told her I didn't, not because he deserved the mercy, but because I deserved to stop spending my energy on people who had already shown me exactly who they were. My focus now is simpler, keeping what's mine, choosing carefully who gets access to it. I think about that hospital room often, the folder on my lap, the 9 days I don't remember, and the 6 days within them that changed everything. I think about how easily a family can decide, in the space of a single conversation, that a person too weak to object is a person whose wishes no longer matter. If the people who are supposed to protect you make their biggest decisions in the moments you're least able to stop them, what does that tell you about what they actually think you're worth? I'd like to know what you would have done, sitting in that bed, looking down at a house that was never theirs to give away.